Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and give this talk. And thanks to everyone who's been organising these webinars as well. I think it's been a really good forum for communicating amongst ornithologists in the region. It's been really good. Hopefully, I can keep the standard reasonably high, as it has been. So my talk, I've titled it African Live Bird Trade, but I am particularly focused on parrots in what I'm talking about, but hopefully drawing out some general issues that are relevant to the trade in live birds in general. And I will talk a bit at the end about trade in other birds from Africa and some recent work that has been done on that front. So yeah, just to start really with a bit of the context for parrots. So there are globally around 400 species that are recognised of parrots, distributed throughout the tropics and in some temperate areas in the southern hemisphere. This map is a heat map showing species diversity of parrots, and so the hotter the colour, the redder the colour, the greater the diversity. And one thing that's quite striking about this map is actually that Africa is pretty cold in terms of the diversity of parrots that occur there. I won't delve into the reasons why that may be, but despite there being relatively few parrot species on the continent, maybe around 25, depending on which book you're reading, there's still a sort of quite remarkable diversity of species ranging from rosy-faced lovebirds, which are found in the very arid areas of southwest Africa, yellow-faced parrots that are found in the Afro-montane forests of Ethiopia, and then there are also some very sort of rare and poorly, well, maybe not rare isn't the right word, very poorly known species such as the neem parrots, which, as far as we know, were only really photographed in the wild for the first time a few years ago, and there's very little information. There's been very little research, very few records even of the species occurrence that occur in areas of Central African Republic, Southern Sudan and Chad. Why focus on parrots? Well, parrots are, by some measures, more threatened than any comparable group of birds. So this shows the red list index for each parrot. So the red list index is a kind of aggregate score of overall threat status of a group of animals or group of species. And the lower the red list index, the worse the situation is. And as you can see, parrots are right on the bottom here, and things are worsening. You might also notice that this is actually quite out of date now. So that was the situation up until 2012. There's an need for someone to update this to see if these patterns are still holding. And why are parrots so threatened? There's a few different reasons. A lot of species bodies have a slow life history, and they therefore are quite vulnerable to perturbations in the populations. Populations are slow to recover. They're very susceptible to high levels of mortality, particularly amongst adult birds. Many ecologically specialized, so most parrots are secondary cavity nesters. They use cavities in trees, generally the old mature trees, and so often heavily impacted by deforestation and the loss of growth forests. Quite a few species are island endemics, and are impacted by a lot of the threats that impact many island species, such as invasive species. That's particularly the case for the species that occur on the Indian Ocean islands. And something that's particularly unusual, although not unique to parrots, is that they are exploited in very large numbers, primarily for the pet trade. And all of these factors combined mean that as a group, they're very vulnerable. So that's really why the World Parrot Trust exists. Just a brief introduction to the World Parrot Trust. It was established in 1980 at a zoological park in southwest England. It's since expanded to have offices in a number of different countries and representatives. And about 10 years ago, the Africa region program was launched, and that was when I joined the World Parrot Trust. And our sort of model as an organization is we have an overall strategy, and then to implement that, we work with local partners, local stakeholders in a lot of different situations to support projects, develop projects, provide support in various ways, as well as conducting research sort of in-house with World Parrot Trust staff, and engaging in a lot of advocacy and policy processes as well. And this is our tagline. Yeah, helping parrots survive in the wild and flourish in companion care. And that basically reflects our dual mission. One is about the conservation of parrots in the wild, and the other is about ensuring the good welfare of parrots that are in captivity. And trade issues cut across both of those missions. So very much central to a lot of our work. And that's a big, important area of priority for us. So the bird trade has a long and complex history. People have kept and traded parrots and other birds for a very long time. This is a picture of an inscription on a rock that was dated to 900 AD in Albuquerque, where there were no parrots and no macaws certainly occurring at that time. But this presumably reflects trade in parrots from Central America into North America, dating back certainly many hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. And birds have been kept in many other places around the world for a very long time. A recent assessment suggests that well over a third of bird species are traded in some form, and around 10% of those species are traded for the pet trade. And people keep pets for a number of different reasons: companionship, for competitions, such as singing competitions, for entertainment purposes, and also for sort of prestige purposes. And why does it matter? Well, overexploitation of wild populations can lead to biodiversity loss, consequent loss of ecosystem function and services. Spillover of infection, trade can cause the spillover of infectious diseases, which can have implications for human health, implications for agriculture, and implications for the conservation of other wild species. The spread of invasive species, such as ringneck parakeets, which have become in a large number of countries, which can have impacts in the countries where they've become invasive species, and also animal welfare. This, to put Africa in context, this attempts to do that. This is taken from a paper that I don't think has been published yet, but is available early online, which looks at the prevalence of birds in trade. And the term prevalence doesn't reflect the quantity of birds per se, but it reflects how frequently those species occur in various databases that exist, such as the CITES trade database. But I think something that's quite striking here, again, this is a heat map. So these red areas in Africa indicate where there are relatively large numbers of species that are relatively frequently listed in these databases. So an important center for trade in birds. And another source of information that can be drawn on is also the CITES trade database. So CITES is the International Convention on Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. It's the sort of, and one of it basically is the main multilateral process through which species are regulated. Between international trade in species is regulated, and primarily it works through putting species on different appendices. Species in Appendix 1, Appendix 2, and Appendix 3 are regulated to varying extents, and countries are required to report on levels of trade. So those species that are in those appendixes, we have good data on, well, relatively good data on the numbers that are in trade. And if you look at that data, Africa is a leading source of wild birds for the global market. Over 3.3 million parrots have been reported in basically all trade that's been permitted under CITES over the last 40 or so years. And African parrots were 3 of the top 4 most traded wild birds listed under CITES. Until recently, that's a changing situation, primarily because there was an enormous trade in African grey parrots, which the legal is now ended. Just some examples of what the trade looks like. There's got a short video here, taken relatively recently in a trader's facility. There's a lot of rose-ringed parakeets there. Parrots feature prominently, but also other parrot species. But it's not at all limited to parrots. Doves commonly traded, and lots of songbirds. Things like small whack-bills, manakins, finches, pin-tailed whyders. But also many larger species are traded. So crown cranes, marabou storks, a lot of raptors, and lots of hornbills as well. So the World Parrot Trust have a multifaceted approach to trying to address trade. At the center of everything we do is research to try and understand how, where, when, and why things are being trapped and what the impacts of that might be. And that will inform a diversity of conservation actions, such as protecting sites where potentially parrots are being trapped, working with communities, developing alternative livelihood approaches, advocacy for stronger legislation, and forums such as CITES, but also with corporations in the air transport sector and technology sector. Support for enforcement, so conducting investigations to try and understand trade routes and try and pass information to enforcement agencies who can potentially act on that information. And really hand in hand with that is what we call our Fly Free program, which was set up to provide support for people on the front line dealing with confiscated parrots, be that local enforcement agencies, local rescue centres, or other people who are trying to deal with the consequences of when parrots are confiscated from trade. Demand reduction is an important part of our strategy. So through raising awareness, educating people who own parrots, who might be considering purchasing parrots. And a really important part of everything we do is around capacity building and trying to mentor, support people who will go on to become tomorrow's conservation leaders in parrot conservation. So I'm now going to talk a bit about African grey parrots, because a lot of our work has been focused on them, and that's because they are one of the most traded species. Now, African grey parrots were split into 2 species in 2012. So prior to that, there was Timneh parrots, which occur from Western Ivory Coast westwards through to Guinea-Bissau, and African grey parrots, which occur from Eastern Ivory Coast right the way through the Congo Basin into Uganda and Kenya in the far east of their range. They're highly social species. They're very conspicuous. They move around in large aggregations to roost overnight communal roosts, and they come, aggregate together to feed, to come to clearings in the forests of Central Africa. and also breed in a sort of semi-colonial way in aggregations. And this makes them particularly vulnerable to trapping because it's relatively easy to trap them in large numbers using decoy lure birds to bring birds in. Large flocks can be trapped, and it's relatively efficient to trap large numbers. We also have a slow life history. They don't start breeding till they're about 3 or 4 years old and produce maybe 1 to 2 chicks a year. So quite vulnerable to high levels of offtake of adults and chicks. And they've undergone very rapid population declines. There's now data from a number of different areas of their range which indicate rapid declines. In some places, such as in Ghana, a study by Nathaniel Nombre showed populations there had declined by between 90 and 99% in less than 2 generations. So in 2016, they were recategorized by the IUCN on the red list to endangered. And this decline in populations has been largely attributed to overexploitation for trade. Although there was a legal trade regulated by CITES for many, many years, it was not regulated very effectively. And so many of the trade measures that were put in place, such as quotas, were not adhered to. So quotas were very regularly exceeded, and frequently parrots were being exported from countries that didn't have any native populations, or being exported under the guise of being captive bred, even though there were no captive breeding facilities in those countries. And in 2016, countries got together, when this was all well documented, what was happening to these wild populations and the problems with the regulation of trade. Countries got together and voted to transfer grey parrots to Appendix 1 of CITES, which basically ended the international trade in wild source parrots for commercial purposes. So it didn't prevent trade in captive bred parrots, but it did require additional measures to be put in place to regulate that trade in captive bred parrots. So I'm just going to talk about 2 projects, two field projects that we're involved with various partners and individuals. Some of them are who I hope are in here. So one project in Sierra Leone, which has involved conducting research to understand where there are key populations, understand the threats to populations, raising awareness at the national level and with local communities about the threats facing parrots, and also moving towards improved site protection in areas where they're threatened. So yeah, this has been in collaboration with a number of different organizations and individuals, which I'll talk about. So first off, conducting research. So Moma Sase and Professor Arnold Oconee-Williams from Bora Bay College at the University of Freetown conducted surveys throughout the coastal area of Sierra Leone and to the southeast of Freetown to understand more about the status of Timneh parrots and the threats that were occurring there, primarily relying on the collection of local ecological knowledge, basically just speaking to people who lived in the communities, following a sort of standardized questionnaire to understand more about the distribution of parrots, seasonal movements, perceptions of trade and knowledge, and the socioeconomic context of trapping and trade that was taking place. And in combination with that, conducting direct transect surveys to observe parrots and collect more systematic data. And that revealed a number of important things. Firstly, that there was, in some areas, chicks were being taken from nests to be used for local ownership, so be kept locally as pets in some cases, and also to enter trade, both at a national and an international level. One of the exciting things that came out of it was a number of roosts were identified, including one roost which contains several hundred Timneh parrots, which at the time was the largest known roost for Timneh parrots anywhere within their range. So extremely encouraging information, suggesting that there are sort of relatively robust or substantial populations, at least in the hundreds, in this area, and also identified breeding areas as well. So this photo here, we think, might well be the first time that the courtship behaviour of wild Timneh parrots has been caught on camera. It's quite sort of remarkable, really, that although Timneh parrots are relatively common parrot in trade, they're relatively familiar to people in homes sort of around the world, and there's certainly probably hundreds of thousands of them. We know extremely little about them in the wild, and indeed, there are very few photos and videos of wild Timneh parrots going back a few years. And then following on from that work, Abubakar Kone has been conducting more focused research on a specific area that seemed to be particularly important as part of MSc that he was doing at Aplori, supervised by Hazel Thompson, Paul Robinson, Grace Pan, and Talatu Tende, using occupancy modeling to understand more about the habitat associations of Timneh parrots. They're abundant in this particular area, and one of the key findings of this research is that it's clear that Timneh parrots have quite a strong association with mangroves in this area. We don't fully understand why there is that association, whether or not it's a genuine habitat preference for mangroves at certain times of year, potentially because this is where parrots go to breed and where they roost, or whether or not it's more just that the mangroves have basically provided a safe refuge for Timneh parrots, which have been trapped in more accessible areas of their distribution. And then additional work that's been taking place is an awareness raising drive for having community meetings in key communities within this area, erecting billboards, doing radio programs, to be all in collaboration with the National Protected Areas Authority, to raise awareness about the threats facing parrots and try and build community support for initiatives to protect them. Next steps based on this, we think that quite like this area in to the southeast of Freetown, Yari Bay and Shebro Bay, or Shebro River estuary areas, may well qualify as a key biodiversity area, given the importance of the Timneh parrot populations that are there. And I think that would be a really valuable step towards getting perhaps more formal recognition of this area, and more focused efforts on conservation of Timneh parrots and the area's protection. A number of actions to help conserve Timneh parrots are included within the co-management plan for the Shebro River estuary area, including the possibility of developing ecotourism around roost sites for Timneh parrots. So that's something else to be explored. It's going to shift slightly eastward to a project focused on the African grey parrots in Nigeria. And this is work being led by Ifeanyi Ezenwa, who is a lecturer at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka and also a PhD candidate there. And he has been working for a number of years to conduct research to understand more about the status and distribution of parrots in Nigeria, and the threats that they face, and develop and implement a number of actions based on that research. So similar to some of the work in Sierra Leone, Ifeanyi has been visiting local communities, interviewing people, conducting line transect surveys throughout the whole distribution of grey parrots in Nigeria. So it's a countrywide survey, as well as interviewing traders and other actors along the trade chain. So Nigeria is the trade of grey parrots in Nigeria is very prevalent. They are sold on the roadside, they are sold at market stalls. You can go on the internet and find parrots for sale. And Nigeria has actually had very strong laws prohibiting the keeping and trade of African grey parrots for many years. There's been very little enforcement, very little implementation of those laws, and there's very little awareness of the protection that grey parrots have. And so it was relatively easy for Ifeanyi to go around and speak to people and collect data on where parrots are being trapped, where they're being traded, the trade routes, and various aspects of the socioeconomics of that trade. And parrots are not only trapped and traded in Nigeria for the pet trade, but also parts and derivatives are traded and sold for belief-based uses, such as traditional medicine. So yeah, Ifeanyi's been documenting areas where trapping has been taken place, both of adults and juveniles. And this is quite important because there are sort of two main methods through which parrots are captured and taken to supply the trade. One is the capture of adults, which is probably particularly harmful in terms of the sustainability of populations. And the other is to take chicks from nests, which is maybe relatively less impactful because of the life history stage that's being targeted. These maps show the distribution of where two forms of trapping take place in Nigeria. And there's a couple of interesting things to take from this. So on the left, this is the capture of adults, and the color of these points indicates the magnitude of the threat. So black dots indicate where there was no record of this threat occurring, red dots indicating where it was high. So we created an index of trapping pressure. And what's sort of one thing that's interesting is this region in Cross River, close to the border of Cameroon. There's relatively high levels of capture of adults, but no trapping of, as far as we could detect, of chicks from nests. And whereas in the western parts here, there's actually relatively little trapping at all, and that correlates with areas where there's the highest abundance of parrots and relatively high levels of protection within protected areas. Don't need to worry about the details of these, but one of the things Ifeanyi was able to do was to describe the commodity chains in various ways of both the trade in live parrots and parts and derivatives. And this is a very useful tool for understanding where it might make sense to focus enforcement efforts and also demand reduction efforts and community-based site protection efforts to try and disrupt trade. One of the things that we still don't really understand is the extent to which the trade in parrot parts and derivatives intersects with the trade in live parrots. We understand that at least some of the parts and derivatives that end up being sold in markets are essentially bycatch from the live bird trade. Lots of birds die during the trade process of capture and transport. And so a lot of those will end up being sold on markets. But we also know that in some areas, parrots are hunted specifically to supply the trade in parts and derivatives. So that's an area that we need to understand a lot better, because I think it will help inform where it makes sense to focus efforts. So, for example, if parrots are turning up in markets, parrot parts are being sold in markets purely as a result of bycatch from the trade in live parrots, it maybe makes sense to focus on disrupting that trade in live parrots rather than focusing on demand reduction efforts to address trade in body parts and derivatives. One of the more exciting findings that came out of Ifeanyi's research was the discovery of a pretty large roost of African grey parrots, and using night binoculars, monitoring that that roost to try and understand, and a couple of other roosts, try and understand or get a better handle on the numbers, because one of the things about this particular roost is that the parrots only arrive very late at night and they leave very early in the morning, and it's very difficult to get an accurate count of the parrots coming and going. But once they've settled for the evening, it's possible to use night vision binoculars to count the number of parrots. And these are being counted regularly, and at certain times of year there's over 700 parrots which are there, which is a very significant number of parrots, and really good news, given that going back a few years, people were hazarding there was maybe only a few hundred African grey parrots left in the whole of Nigeria. And just at this one site in West Africa, in western parts of Nigeria, there's several hundred at the very least. But I called this an imperfect fortress, and that's because this roost actually is within an oil palm plantation which adjoins a Congo National Park. And essentially we think that this roost exists, and it's the only significant roost that anyone's aware of in Nigeria. There used to be other large roosts, but Ifani's been to visit those and they've all disappeared. So this is quite possibly the only large roost in Nigeria that still exists. And probably the reason it exists is because it's within this oil palm plantation, where it's essentially protected from trappers. So the oil palm plantation has recognized this as a high conservation value area, put in place measures to prevent disturbance to the parrots when they're roosting and protect this site. But this tree in the background here is this tree where the parrots roost. And I just think this is a really kind of bittersweet image, really, of this is one of the few places where there's a significant communal roost, which is a really special site, and now a very rare site. But it's essentially a lone tree that's probably not going to be there forever inside an otherwise very bleak and desolate landscape. Building on the research that Ifani's been doing, coordinated a stakeholder workshop to build support around a number of actions and recommendations to improve the conservation of African grey parrots. Building on from that, Ifani's been doing a lot of work over the last year trying to understand more about the relationships between African grey parrots and oil palm plantations. But we've also been working hard to engage law enforcement agencies to increase enforcement to address a lot of the trade in African grey parrots, which happens so openly and without any awareness in cases that this is a prohibited activity. And there's been a number of seizures of African grey parrots recently as a result of this, which we're thrilled about. And we're currently working hard to build capacity to manage those parrots, and where possible rehabilitate them and release them back to the wild. And that actually brings us nicely to our Fly Free program, which is another sort of large component of what we do, which is supporting groups dealing with parrots confiscated from trade. And we do this for multiple reasons. It's important obviously for the welfare of those parrots, and potentially for the conservation of the wild populations, if the parrots that are confiscated can be returned to the wild in places where reinforcement makes sense to bolster wild populations. But it's also a really important component of any strategy to address wildlife trade, because it isn't somewhere where live animals seized from trade can go, then very often those seizures don't happen. So if we can take the burden off the shoulders of some of the law enforcement people who are on the front line trying to deal with trade in live animals, find good ways that those animals can be managed, responsible, humane, safe ways, that can be a really important catalyst for improving enforcement responses. So yeah, but in many cases there's a need for providing technical, financial, and logistical support, so advice in emergency situations, and building aviaries, transport containers, and things like that. So we play a role in advising different agencies in how to do that. But we're also increasingly being proactive in terms of trying to build capacity in areas where it's most important, rather than just responding to emergency situations. So delivering training to first responders in particular. Yeah, last year, one area we've been quite focused and increasingly focused is in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Actually, let me come to that. And there are also very important opportunities for raising awareness around trade, because very often, if parrots can be released back into the wild, the event of releasing them back into the wild can be, it's very newsworthy in countries, and it's an opportunity to engage decision makers to participate in a release ceremony, and it can be very powerful for raising the profile. So this photo is of a release in Uganda, where Jane Goodall came to actually open the cage, and there were 4 film crews from around Uganda came to film that, number of journalists, and it got a lot of media attention and helped to increase the profile of African grey parrots and African grey parrot trade in that country. Yeah, as I was saying, an important area of focus is in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's a really important centre for trade in parrots at the moment. It's probably the primary source of parrots for the international trade, and it's also the home to the most important and significant wild populations. 50% of the range of African grey parrots occurs within the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's a really, really important place to focus efforts. We've been working with the Rural Primary Rehabilitation Centre in Bukavu in the east of the DRC, and we're thrilled in 2021 when there was the first soft release of grey parrots ever in DRC. So there's been lots of seizures of grey parrots over the years. Very often those parrots either end up going back into trade or languishing in rescue facilities or zoos, or they're released entirely inappropriately. So very often African grey parrots and other parrots will have had their primary feathers cut when they've been trapped to stop them flying away. And so they need time to regrow those feathers, build the strength to fly. And frequently releases are done for parrots that simply can't fly. So they're just being tipped out into the wild with no chance of survival, and very sadly. Yeah, so in 2021, there was the first ever soft release of grey parrots in DRC, which is a really important landmark, and that was attended by the national park director and I think one of the provincial ministers, I forget exactly, but important local dignitaries who wanted to be there and participate in this event. And again, that got important local media coverage, was on the radio and things. And building on from that, we're working with partners in Kindu in a project to develop capacity to receive parrots close to Kindu, which is an important centre for trade. So Luiro is quite some distance from where a lot of parrots are being trapped. So it's often a huge logistical challenge to move parrots from there to get them to Luiro. And so we've established, or we're trying to establish, a sort of satellite rehabilitation facility where parrots can be received. But that's a very important part of a pillar of a much bigger project focused on addressing the trade in grey parrots in the DRC, which involves engaging with communities. It involves strengthening protection of wild populations through the strengthening legal frameworks. But the Parrot Release Centre, the Conservation Centre, is a really, really important part of that. And the provincial minister has been to visit this site and for Maniema province, and recently declared a provincial moratorium on the trapping and trade of grey parrots, which is fantastic news, and that's been widely disseminated. So again, it demonstrates the value of building capacity for dealing with live animals for achieving broader goals. Okay, how long have I got? Okay, I'm going to talk very briefly about online trade. So the internet, I don't think it's stretching the truth too much to say that the internet has really supercharged wildlife trade. A lot of wildlife trade now happens online. It drives demand. It connects buyers and sellers in ways that was never done before, and it allows people to exchange knowledge about how to trade birds. But it also provides some opportunities as well. It allows us to monitor the trade that's taking place. It provides, and it also provides opportunities to educate people. So, just as people are going online to learn about keeping parrots and other birds as pet, which might stimulate their interest in doing that, it also provides opportunities to help educate people about the decisions that they might be making. Together with the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, we conducted some research into online markets for African grey parrots in Africa on e-commerce platforms, and particularly in Nigeria and Kenya, where there are large numbers of adverts, people selling African grey parrots and other parrots. And we also worked with BBC Click program to do some investigations into that trade. And as a result of that, an engagement with some of the technology companies and some work of journalists, particularly in Nigeria as well recently, there's been some really good progress to achieve enhanced moderation policies on some of those platforms. So some platforms have removed adverts for African grey parrots entirely, and some have updated their policies to prohibit that trade. Still lots of work to be done there, but there's important progress has been made. Some of the work into online trade also revealed useful information about which airlines were being used to traffic parrots, and to show that airlines were not fulfilling some of their obligations that they had made under various international agreements. And we're able to use that information to put pressure on some airlines to improve some of their policies, increase training, and increase capacity at airports. Again, a huge amount more needs to be done to work with airlines to improve the ways that trade in live animals is managed. But it can be done. Right, now I'm going to pivot I'm going to stop talking about parrots, and I'm going to start talking about what we know about trade in other birds. Now, parrots are interesting and somewhat unusual, really, in that most of the species of parrots are listed on the CITES appendices. So we have some data reported by countries on the numbers of parrots that are in trade. But for many species of birds that are not listed on the CITES appendices, we don't really have any information. So this is a figure taken from a study from a few years ago, which was looking into the impact of the EU's ban on the importation of wild-caught birds on bird trade. And the important thing to take from this map was that prior to 2005, around 70% of the trade in CITES listed birds was from basically from West Africa to Europe. Most of that coming from Guinea, Mali, and Senegal. This is a figure of the volume of CITES listed birds over time. At its peak in 2000, over 1.6 million birds CITES listed birds being reported in trade. And then in 2006, it all but ended. and that coincided with the EU ban on importation of wild birds, but which led to the conclusion that the EU ban had dramatically reduced global trade in birds, and indeed it had, and it made an enormously important difference. But that something else happened at that same time, which is that 116 of some of the most traded African species, including many of the species that were in that video that I showed earlier on, were actually removed from the CITES appendices. So that had the effect that countries were no longer obliged, required and recommended to report trade in those species to CITES. So it leaves a big question. 85% bird species are not on the CITES appendices. There's not data being collected that goes into these databases, and we just don't really know. So, did this trade completely drop off, or just that we stopped recording the data? And of course, we know that over the last 2 decades, there's been a big increase in demand and interest in the ownership of exotic pets and birds in parts of the Middle East and Asia. So, but we don't really know, and we don't have any good ways of telling what the scale and scope of this trade is. I'm just going to talk through 2 ways that we can get some insight into that. So one is a study that used insights from monitoring social media to look at exports from West African countries. Now, it's important to bear in mind that this is not illegal trade. These are not CITES species, or at least it's, we can't be sure if any of it's legal trade. It's perfectly feasible that this is legal trade. These are not CITES species. They're not protected. And we don't know, whether or not it's particularly of concern for conservation. But what we did was monitor the birds that a number of West African bird sellers were advertising online, looked at the species, the quantities, and the engagement that with these adverts that was taking place. Over the 4-year period of the study, there were 427 posts, 83 different species from 26 families. And this is just the top 15 birds that were being advertised. Some of these are CITES listed species. These 4 in the yellow boxes are all CITES species, but the rest are not CITES species. And yeah, this is just an example of the sort of the diversity of species that were being offered for sale. There were some species that were being advertised which are not recorded previously to be in trade. So it provided new insights into which species were being traded. And certainly there are some endangered or threatened and CITES listed species that shouldn't be in trade being encountered. Number of invasive species, number of species that listed in the World Animal Health Information System as carrying notifiable diseases. So some reasons to be concerned. And then we also looked at the engagement with those posts. And so each of the circles, so these are posts on a social media platform, so you can look at the likes and the comments that are made. And the circles here indicate the degree of engagement from different countries. And we defined what we called trade-related engagement, which was any engagement that indicated some interest in engaging with trade, be that asking about price, asking about which countries things can be shipped to, or asking for, yeah. And what you can see from this is that India, Pakistan, Bangladesh to some extent are really important or potentially important centres, certainly for interest. I mean, it's difficult to say that there are birds moving, but these are areas where people are expressing an interest in purchasing birds from these West African traders. A second approach we've been exploring is the use of customs data. So all UN members submit customs data to the World Customs Institute every year, and different commodities have different codes, and there's a code for live birds that excludes most of the CITES listed species. So in theory, it's quite a good proxy measure for non-CITES birds. And we specifically looked at trade into Hong Kong and Singapore, primarily because those are the countries that had some of the best data available, not necessarily because we thought they were the most important countries, but they are also very important hubs for commerce in the region, and known to be hubs for wildlife trade as well. And these are some of the data from this. So over the period between 2006 and 2020, there's over 1 million birds imported into those two countries, and 70% of which from Africa. So Africa, the main source of non-CITES birds to those two countries. If you break it down by country, a lot of those exports are coming from Mali and Guinea. In the past, they came from Tanzania, but Tanzania stopped exporting wildlife a few years back and has dropped off from this picture. But we were quite surprised to see significant numbers of birds being exported from Mozambique, which was not something that we had heard of or were aware of. And then we also managed to get hold of some customs data of imports on a species basis into Hong Kong. And the one thing that was very striking about this was that most of the birds that seemed to be being imported, according to these records, were species of canaries, over 95% of them canaries. And there's often been an assumption previously that lots of the canaries that are seen for sale in Hong Kong and other places must be captive bred. But this would suggest that actually probably they're primarily wild caught. Right, I will wrap things up there, as I think I'm running out of time. But just some take-home messages, really. I think, yeah, vast numbers of birds are exported from Africa each year. It's not just parrots. A lot of that trade is legal and loosely regulated. There's an urgent need, I think, for more monitoring of this trade, and in particular to understand the impact on wild populations and other harms, particularly linked to the spread of infectious diseases. A lot of countries have banned the importation of wild-caught birds because of concerns about the spread of bird flu and other diseases. And I find it quite remarkable that any countries are really willing to take the risk of importing significant numbers of wild birds from anywhere. Yeah, the interactions between trade and different species are complex. I haven't really touched on that much in my talk, but as you'll have seen from the video at the beginning, some of the trade in parrots and some of the trade in illegal trade in highly threatened parrots, such as African greys, overlaps with the legal trade in other birds. And so the same individuals who are involved in legal trade might also be involved in illegal trade. And there's a lot of fuzziness around, or a lot of confusion often around what's legal and what isn't, both amongst actors in the trade, but also amongst them as an enforcement people. And so figuring out how best to regulate trade needs to take into account some of the challenges of distinguishing between different species, identifying different species and understanding the different rules and laws and regulations that pertain to different species in different jurisdictions. Yeah, and it's obvious, really, but we need coordinations by governments, NGOs, corporations, and other stakeholders to address this. And I think what's fundamental is that interventions must be multifaceted. Yes, enforcement is an important part of things, but we need we need a strong focus on demand reduction. We need to understand a lot more about what's driving the demand, where the demand is coming from, and how to address that. Consider the socioeconomics of all the actors along the supply chain and involve stakeholders throughout in trying to develop, well, understand firstly. I mean, we're getting a much better understanding of what's going on, but there's still lots of unanswered questions to understand how to address this trade and how best to, well, understand the impacts it's having and how best to address it.
So first, thanks for Mr. Martin. So I will do the summary in French. Donc pour résumer, donc Monsieur Martin, il travaille pour le programme de la World Parrot Trust, surtout pour tout ce qui concerne la région africaine. Donc durant sa présentation, il a parlé un petit peu de la façon dont le commerce d'oiseaux exotiques et donc le commerce des perroquets impacte les populations de perroquets sauvages en Afrique. Et donc, il a présenté notamment dans les actions menées dans 3 pays, si je me souviens bien. Donc, d'abord, donc ça concerne 2 espèces, le perroquet gris et le perroquet de Timène. Et donc, il y a un projet qui concerne la Sierra Leone. Donc là, ils ont mené des projets notamment de recherche et de suivi des populations. Et ils ont trouvé, par exemple, que les perroquets étaient associés aux zones de mangrove. Donc, ils ont voulu un peu estimer la population et aussi essayer euh, de sensibiliser les populations locales par rapport au commerce de ces perroquets sauvages. Ensuite, donc, il y a eu un autre projet au Nigeria, donc qui est un petit peu sensiblement le même. En fait, ils essayaient d'étudier l'impact du commerce et notamment de la capture des oiseaux sur les populations sauvages. En fait, le principal problème est que les perroquets ont une reproduction assez lente, c'est-à-dire que les individus adultes, en général, mettent plusieurs années avant de commencer à se reproduire. Donc, le problème de prendre des individus adultes, la population ne peut pas se renouveler. Donc, il y a une forte pression, notamment au Nigeria, de capture des individus adultes. Et par contre, ils avaient remarqué que lorsqu'ils comparaient donc, la pression de capture dans les zones protégées et les zones non protégées, les populations étaient en meilleure santé dans les zones protégées. Et notamment, ils avaient trouvé au Nigeria, donc, lors de suivis nocturnes, un dortoir. Donc, en fait, c'était un arbre mort où les oiseaux passaient la nuit. Et ils avaient trouvé plus de 700 perroquets qui utilisaient ce dortoir. Et en fait, cet arbre mort était situé dans une zone agricole. Et donc, ils ont développé un programme qui s'appelle Fly Free, dont le but est de secourir les oiseaux qui ont été capturés, de les mener dans des centres de réhabilitation pour pouvoir s'en occuper et les soigner et de plus tard pouvoir les libérer dans la nature. Donc, il y a eu des programmes pour justement libérer ces individus sauvages dans différents pays africains et à chaque fois, ils essayaient de médiatiser au maximum le fait de relâcher ces individus dans la nature. Et donc, globalement, l'action en fait du World Parrot Trust est à la fois donc de mener des recherches sur les populations pour comprendre justement leur dynamique, est-ce qu'elles sont en régression, dans quelles régions elles sont en régression, et d'essayer de développer la coordination entre les gouvernements, les ONG et aussi les populations locales pour à la fois sensibiliser mais aussi réhabiliter l'habitat des perroquets sauvages. Et enfin, une des actions aussi de cette organisation, c'est de surveiller donc, le commerce d'oiseaux sauvages et notamment de perroquets, notamment donc, le commerce en ligne, puisque maintenant, avec le développement des technologies, il y a de plus en plus d'échanges qui sont faits en ligne. Et donc, l'idée, c'est aussi de suivre un petit peu ces échanges et de les quantifier et de créer des lois qui sont adaptées justement à ce commerce en ligne.